All right. Thank you all for coming to Working Group 1 webinar, Understanding the Magnitude of the Legal Wildlife Trade. With us today is Alice Catherine Hughes. Alice is Associate Professor at the School of Biological Sciences at the Faculty of Science at the University of Hong Kong. Alice studied zoology at the University of Bristol in graduating in 2007 and then completed a PhD 4 years later. Her research aims to ensure that biodiversity policy reflects the best of biodiversity science and works to actively communicate conservation standards and tools on a regional and global basis. Thank you so much for joining us, Alice, and thank you to the rest of the people who are in the participants list. Thank you all for coming, and Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me, especially as today is Biodiversity Day. So it's a day that hopefully we should all be talking about biodiversity, especially as there are so many aspects that just get forgotten and are often not figured into international policy and just escape all of our mindsets. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that I and collaborators of mine have done. One of them is an audience member on the call, so thank you for tuning in, Pedro. And I'll be talking about various different elements of what this trade looks like at different scales and why it matters. So we often hear about the fact that we are on a planet in crisis. It's predicted that about 1 million animal and plant species are currently threatened with extinction. Since the industrial period, we've lost an estimated 1 to 2.5% of vertebrate species, as well as a host of other taxa. We're also seeing the continued loss of habitats across the planet. For example, the almost halving of forest over the last 60 years. And yet, rather than reversing these destructive trends on global biodiversity, we see them continuing, with an estimated average of the loss of 10 million hectares of forest every year. Furthermore, if we look more widely across the biosphere, we see that according to the planetary boundary concept, we have now transcended 6 of the planetary boundaries, marking irreversible changes in this world's biosphere and basically providing us with no way back to a healthy planet for ourselves and the next generation. And yet we're still failing to complete global targets. And furthermore, when we talk about global biodiversity loss, we often fixate on a very small portion of the drivers of global biodiversity loss. We think about climate change. We think about illegal wildlife trade of a subset of species and the loss of a few major ecosystems. And yet this isn't representative of the suite of other pressures, including a magnitude of other species that we often don't even think about existing. And yet, because of this, and because of the destruction of habitats across the planet and the unsustainable use of resources, including wild species, it's estimated that since the 1960s, we've seen a 73% decrease in wildlife populations around the planet. And whilst this figure is inaccurate, highly inaccurate, because sadly we don't have good data, it does give us cause for alarm in terms of the fact that we are not collecting the data we need to understand what trends of wildlife healthy populations look like around the planet, and the fact that we are still failing to understand and deal with the multifaceted pressures that currently threaten wildlife around the planet. So these drivers of loss are multifaceted. They include major drivers like the loss and degradation of natural habitats and the unsustainable use of resources. And sadly, that includes wildlife. And yet, whilst we are starting to get better at tracking the loss of forests, etc., across the planet, there are a suite of other pressures that we commonly forget about. And so within the context of the Kunming to Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there are 4 major goals, and this is split into 23 targets. Today, I'm mainly going to be talking about data that fits into targets 5 and 9. These both look at the unsustainable use of wildlife. However, I want to tell you all now, spoiler alert, that the only indicator we currently have as a mandated indicator for all wildlife trade is the sustainable harvest of fish for consumption, which is a tiny percentage of wildlife in trade. And we are still failing to database key data that we need to understand and manage this sustainably and efficiently. So let's think about the direct exploitation of wildlife. Now, GLITSS is looking at illegal trade, but sadly, as we all know, where there is legal, there is illegal, and these two often blend together, creating a hard-to-manage grey landscape where we get an entire gradient with everything happening in between. But first off, not all wildlife trade is illegal. When people hear the term wildlife trade, their brain immediately goes to illegal trade before they tuck into their fish and chips for lunch. We tend to forget the myriad of ways that we use wildlife, even in our day-to-day lives. So legal trade is valued at about 100 billion annually in the EU alone, and over 380 billion globally, whereas illegal trade is estimated to be less than a tenth of that. This includes more than 180 billion in fish trade, more than 200 billion in the timber trade, and this includes rare timbers like rosewood, etc. It includes 2.5 billion in the fashion trade. And then there is this corner of trade that always gets forgotten, the wildlife trade for pets. Now, this is important because this is unlike any of the other categories in that it is not a consistent exploitation of the same species, and that it will often, like the fashion industry, have small numbers of species that are shortly in the vogue, and then their popularity decreases. And this means that it is particularly challenging to manage or understand. So let's think a little bit about what legal and illegal wildlife trade look like. Well, first off, illegal wildlife trade is the fourth largest illegal trade of all major forms of trade. And to put that in context, the other ones are things like human trafficking and the trade of arms. And so this is not a small thing. This is a massively valuable thing that often goes alongside other illegal forms of trade, which are highly destructive. As a consequence of this, a significant proportion of global wildlife trade is being monitored by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, as well as Interpol. So we can't afford to underestimate what the magnitude of this trade and its implications are. And yet, despite this and the importance of this illegal trade, legal trade is about 10 times larger. And yet, whilst huge resources are often allocated to combat some elements of illegal trade, we don't even have basic numbers for legal trade. And today I'm going to be going into what we know and all of the gaps in what we don't know, as well as how we could do better by a more consistent and standardized databasing of what is in trade. So, what do we know? Well, when we talk again about wildlife trade, normally people say, oh, you don't need more data, CITES exists. Now, yes, CITES exists to try to regulate the trade of wildlife to ensure that it's sustainable. But there are big problems in this. For one thing, about 70% of all species listed in CITES are orchids. Now, the reason that 70% of CITES listed species, and there are about 38,000 species listed to CITES, so it sounds like a big number until you realize most of them are orchids. But the reason for that was that when CITES was first initiated, they realized that species traded at high values when they often had low populations and were attractive because they were rare was a threat. And so they decided to mass list all orchid species. Unfortunately, what we see in modern day trade is many species that share the exact same traits of orchids are not treated in the same way, despite sharing all of the vulnerabilities that were some of the reasons that CITES was created in the first place. And unfortunately, the majority of species in trade are not monitored by CITES. In fact, for most groups, the majority of species that are traded fall outside CITES, and as a consequence of that, our knowledge of these species is massively fragmented and does not provide us with the basic data we need to manage trade sustainably. For example, whilst there is some data on commercial fish trade, mainly for consumption, for ornamental trade, it's less well regulated, and timber trade, for the majority of species that are traded for the pet trade, we have virtually no data. This is because for those species, they only fall under national systems. And in that case, it's up to the country to decide what it databases and how it regulates it. And as a consequence of that, almost none of that data becomes publicly available. It doesn't have interoperable standards. And that means for some of the world's largest trading blocks on wildlife, like Europe, we do not have publicly available data of what is in trade, despite the fact that it is likely to be the largest trading bloc on the planet. Now, data is being collected. It's being collected through the TRACES system, but that system is not openly available. And from the data that has been seen, has very variable standards in terms of what is recorded. And so no matter what anyone says about this system, it does not provide us with the data we need to understand what is in trade and what species might potentially be at risk. And so to just give some perspective on this, and this is from a paper we published earlier this year, looking at the disparity between some of these. So here, blue is the LEMIS system. LEMIS is the US Fish and Wildlife Services database of wildlife in trade. And so you can see the approximate numbers. Often LEMIS vastly exceeds anything else. So here you can see for birds, gray is what the IUCN says is in trade. And then we also scraped the web to see what that said was in trade. And this tiny little orange bar here that is normally a tiny fraction of all of the others is the CITES data. So when people say, oh, but we already have data from CITES, we don't need more. The issue is that for most of these groups, it is a tiny fraction of what's in trade. I will say more about this later in the talk, but as a brief statistic, about 2.4% of species of amphibian are listed by CITES, and more than 17% are in trade. For the reptiles, probably around 50% of species are in trade, and yet only a tiny fraction of that are listed within CITES, about 9%. And so the majority of species in trade are not covered by CITES, and as a consequence of that, we do not have the volumes or even the species numbers that we need to monitor trade effectively. So what does wildlife trade look like? I previously mentioned that LEMIS is the US Fish and Wildlife Services database of what's in trade. Now, the good thing about LEMIS, because it has many problems, is it basically took the system that had been developed by CITES as its backbone, and it said, we're going to use this for all wildlife that comes into or out of the United States. As part of that, they created a series of harmonized codes that go alongside species names to help basically verify and check, and to provide an easy means of inputting species data. Now, whilst this data is very, very far from perfect, the LEMIS data shows us that between 2000 and 2022, the US imported more than 21,000 species of wildlife. And this is not including domestic animals, this is just wildlife. And when we add CITES data onto this, because LEMIS is not meant to include plants, that comes under a different agency, USDA, that increases to almost 30,000 species. Now, a few moments ago, I talked about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This global framework that is meant to reverse global biodiversity loss and take us towards a set of 23 ambitious targets. But I also mentioned that the only indicator for that was fish. Now here, the US alone is said to import almost 3,000 fish species. It's important to note that while sustainably harvested fish is the headline indicator for the target on wildlife trade, all of these fish species don't come into that because it predominantly focuses on the sustainable harvest of fish for food. And so a percentage of a percentage is actually feeding into this global target. And that means even if we keep on track according to that one indicator, we still may have globally unsustainable wildlife trade around the planet. We still do not know how many species are in trade. Now, I want to dwell on this slide for just a second, because if you look at some of these numbers, they are scary. More than 1,000 butterfly species in trade. This is also notable because IPBES, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, released a report on the sustainable use of biodiversity in terms of harvest and trade. But the problem is that it focused on traditional uses. Because of that, it missed out ornamental trade. And as a consequence, as an example, their total number of terrestrial invertebrates in trade was lower than the number of butterflies we know to be in trade. Now, IPBES said that more than 50,000 species of wildlife are being traded. And yet we know that for many species, it did not measure trade because we forget about them. And that means that the true number of species in trade may be somewhere between 70 and 100,000 species. And yet, despite this, we do not have an accurate number of how many species are in trade. And how do we assess the sustainability of trade when we don't even know what's being traded? Now, of course, to do any form of analysis, the first step is the rigorous cleaning of data, because whilst LEMIS is the best data there is, it is not free from errors. There are all sorts of errors, which I don't have time to go into now. But some brief statistics. So overall, in that 20-year period, when we only look at numbers and we don't include weights, and this is important to note because for things imported in large volumes like fish, it may list the weight. Problem is that that weight can include water. So you can't even do a simple conversion of saying, well, I assume each fish weighs a kilogram, and so a ton must be X fish. You can't do that when there is water or ice in there and you are including that. And so this is only focusing where we could get units that actually came down to the number of individuals. And yet, despite that, we have a little under 3 billion individuals. This includes literally millions of entries because many of these entries, so that's a single database row, may have multiple individuals. And you can see that depending how we slice it, we get very different number in terms of the number of times any set of organisms has been imported versus the total number of individuals when we discount weight. So let's just break this down briefly. So this is about 21,000 species if we just use the LEMIS data and don't use CITES of over 10,000 genera. 29% of this were vertebrates. But then we also got massive numbers in other groups. Now, this is important because once again, when we talk about wildlife trade, people forget about invertebrates. And yet only 30% of this is vertebrates. We are completely forgetting about other groups. And whilst there is often this really naive assumption that, oh, invertebrates reproduce fast, that they'll be fine, we're not going to be importing them in massive numbers. As I will show later in this brief seminar, we know that for many cases, many species, this is not the case. And you can see a small image of beetles there. The problem is that for many species, if they are flashy, if there is a demand for them for ornamental or pet trade, they may well be rare already, and it may drive up the price. And so we may see rare species being disproportionately targeted. And it's only been in the last year that IPBES has started to regulate the trade in these species, because prior to that, and still now to a degree, you can get huge numbers of individuals and species online. If we look at how many of these are endangered, and unfortunately, because invertebrates are often not listed within IUCN, and so most of them do not have any assessment, we can see that literally, if we look on the traded side, we have hundreds of data deficient species being legally traded, but we also have multiple endangered and critically endangered species. Now, it's true, some of these may be going into breeding programs, some of them there may be a legitimate conservation-orientated reason for trading them. But in many cases, these data deficient species are going into the pet trade or the ornamental trade. And because if they are not listed in CITES, there is nothing to stop that, there is no reason why these are not going to fit into any form of trade where they can reach the highest economic value. If we look at the number of species over time, we can also see that whilst in 2016, because of various changes in regulation, the number of vertebrates in trade in terms of species may have decreased. We can see that that isn't the case for most invertebrate groups, where we have seen a continued increase in the number of species in trade. And whilst things like saltwater aquariums have become more popular, this also threatens species that typically come from the wild. And we can also graph this out over time. And so we can see that whilst many species only occur in a single year, this has been observed elsewhere, so maybe something has become popular briefly, many species are traded every year. And so it does vary. Of course, from a conservation perspective, this is only likely to be significant if large numbers of individuals are coming from the wild. And this is where the understanding of the origins of trade becomes so important. So we can see that for many invertebrate groups, 98% of echinoderms and cnidaria, so jellyfish and starfish, most of them are coming from the wild. And this is why if someone shows you their cool saltwater aquarium, it is almost certain that all the individuals in there came from the wild and was associated with major mortality, because the survival rate for some of these groups when they are being traded from the wild is very, very low. And some estimates show that over 70% of individuals will die within the first 3 years. And so we need to think very carefully if we are buying exotic animals for any reason, what are the impacts and implications? Because if we want to have exotic pets, obviously these should be coming from captivity. Now, this has other benefits. If you have invested hundreds or thousands of dollars in your private collection and you bring in an animal from the wild that has a disease or a parasite, you may potentially have lost your collection if they all get sick. And so biosecurity related risks that come with importing animals from the wild should be taken seriously. A good example of this is I live in Hong Kong. Hong Kong and mainland China are very worried about the risk of monkeypox. And yet there have been monkeypox outbreaks in the United States that came directly from prairie dogs imported in for pet trade. And so biosecurity is a threat not only to native wildlife, but also to us. And it's something that we need to take seriously when we see that large numbers of animals are still being imported from the wild. In fact, when we look at things like the number of entries, the majority of them are still coming from wild sources. And whilst it is basically impossible to estimate domestic trade, especially within the US, the fact that this volume of individuals is still coming from the wild should be cause for concern. It's also important to note that if we look at things like the amphibian and reptile trade, certain species have been listed as something called injurious. Now, injurious basically means importing this has a very high risk associated with it. It may bring over things like BSAL and BDEN, which are basically chytrid-based fungal diseases that can wipe out native amphibians. The reason that these species were listed as injurious in 2016 was because of the high risk posed of bringing in these massively detrimental fungal pathogens. Problem is that not only have they continued to be imported legally since then, and we can't state what the level of licensure looked like, but we can see they continue to be imported after that point, and we also see an increase in the amount of export. And so despite known risks associated with this, there are still high trade volumes. We can also see that when we look at why we are seeing trade, again, unsurprisingly, the majority of species overall are coming from the wild. But when we split it and remove commercial trade, because commercial trade is the biggest form of trade for most groups, it is not for nice scientific reasons. It is not for your captive colony. It is for commercial purposes in most instances. And when we look at that, the majority of animals come from the wild, and this becomes even greater when we remove commercial interests. And non-commercial interests can still be semi-commercial. It does include things like zoos and circuses, but the problem is that those are gray areas where some of it may be breeding colonies in captivity for wild release, and some of it is not. We can also look at what these dimensions look like over time. And whilst we have seen a decrease in the amount of wild caught animals in some instances, you can see that in terms of the proportion of all trade, wild trade still makes a large amount in virtually all groups. And when we look at the pure numbers, you can see that for some of these groups in particular, especially aquatic groups, so those things that are going into those marine saltwater aquaria, most of them are coming from the wild. And for some of them, like the sponges and squirts and the echinoderms and cnidaria, they are still showing very high numbers. Now, it's also important, you might note here, the arachnids is a very interesting one. A couple of years ago, with Pedro and others, we did do an assessment of global arachnid trade because selling spiders internationally is a big thing. But we found out that Lemis initially was not databasing most spiders in trade. And so whereas we saw thousands of species for sale online, they were not showing up in import databases. And since then, we have started to see that being recorded. But we know that in many instances, it will not be being recorded because if you send an envelope of the egg cases, etc. in, it's not going to get picked up. And so we know that for invertebrate groups, this is only going to be a tiny fraction of trade that is detected or declared. And in many instances, they know that it's not going to be picked up on an X-ray machine, so it's just being invisible. And you can also see that for insects overall, we are starting to see more declarations, but it may only be the tip of the iceberg when it comes to trade. We can also look at what this looks like in terms of the size of the imports versus the number from the wild. And so we can see that for many of these groups, huge percentages of huge numbers of these various groups, including things like the butterflies, for which thousands of species are in trade, they are still coming from the wild in many instances. And given that we do not have any baseline data on the populations of these species, we cannot say what those implications look like. When there have been studies of populations in trade, it has been found that often they decrease by an average of over 60%. And so when there is data, it shows that this trade is often not sustainable in any way. But for most of them, there is no need to actually do any assessment of the impact or the sustainability. And so it is having a massively negative impact. We can also look at how many species come from these various sources. And here again, if you look at the number of species coming from the wild versus those coming from captivity, you can see that for many of these groups, the majority of them are coming from the wild. Now, some of these species will be coming from both, some individuals coming from the wild, some coming from captivity, some being declared as coming from captivity, but they just got laundered there from the wild. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have these multiple streams of trade means that there is a huge gray zone. And in recent years, there has been an increased demand for captive bred animals because they are less likely to bring in diseases. But because there is no need for certification, it is very easy for people to say, yeah, I bred them captively, when actually they've come from the wild. And so it is a very grey and poorly regulated area. We can also investigate where animals are coming from, and of course plants, but most of this is based on animals because we are using LEMIS data, and LEMIS rarely includes plants. And what we see is, unsurprisingly, a lot of animals are coming from across the global tropics. I will show you later, though I am aware I probably need to speed up, that most of the world's biodiversity hotspots are trading the majority of species, including massive numbers of range-limited and highly threatened species. We can also look, for example, at what percentage are endangered or sustainable. And what we find out in many cases is many animals will be endangered and many come from the wild. So here, green shows that they are coming from captivity, red shows that they are coming from the wild. And you can see that outside Europe and Australia as being the exporters, the majority of animals will be coming from the wild. And for many species, this makes up the majority of animals in trade. We can also look at where there are mismatches, where a country says, yes, this animal came from the wild when it's not native. And this is important because it highlights a potential for misdeclarations. And so if it's not wild and you say it's wild, either there has been an error when that has been input into the system, or they have misdeclared it, or it actually came from a different country first and it has come from the wild, but we haven't declared it. And so the fact that there are so many inconsistencies in these declarations means that there is a massive potential for illegal sourcing. Now, all of this is data coming into the United States, and the United States has the Lacey Act that is meant to ensure that species being imported were not harvested illegally. However, if you are not honestly and accurately declaring where that species originally came from, you have no means to actually enforce this. CITES is also a complicated process. So CITES has appendices 1 and 2, which are basically the international appendices that all countries have to follow. Appendix 3 is an interesting one because a single country may say, I am listing all of my populations of this species as Appendix 3, and that means you need to have a CITES permit to trade it. Problem is that even for endemic species, these may not be well checked. And so what we saw when we looked at this data is there are many instances where Appendix 3 listed species are either coming from the neighboring countries of a country that has said it's Appendix 3, and so it may be laundered over a border and then traded legally when actually it's not legal. And in some instances, the original export country will not be listed. And if the original export country is not listed on a species that is listed as Appendix 3 anywhere, once again, there is no means of enforceability because it may have come from that country and you will not be able to prove it. And so there are clear instances of probably illegal behavior and violations which are not being followed up on because often it's just seen as a trivial issue. And so enough attention is not paid to these types of issue. So when we think about demand, most of this is for the pet trade. Trade bans in Europe for bird trade. So the EU has the EU Bird Directive and the US has the US Wild Bird Conservation Act. These were meant to almost stop the importation of wild birds due to a risk of importing diseases. It was realized not because we were going to harm source populations, but actually we might be importing diseases, so maybe we should do something. The estimated impact of these regulations is a decrease of global trade by an estimated 90%. Now, this number is contentious. It has probably led to more black market trade, which is much harder to monitor. But what isn't questionable is the fact that it has reduced global trade by a massive percentage, and it has also increased the amount of captive breeding within Europe, taking pressure off source populations. And so captive breeding can provide a very viable, much more biosecure alternative. The global aquaria trade, and I've only talked a little bit about this, is known to also impact on thousands of species. And whilst most species that come from freshwater systems are now bred in captivity because it's more cost effective, the majority of marine species are still coming from the wild. When you couple this with other threats like bleaching and the loss of coral reefs, you may have multiple different threats on these coral reef dwelling species. And at the moment, they're not being well accounted for. Furthermore, for many of these species, especially butterflies and various fish species, the actual species name may not be declared. It might just say LEP for Lepidoptera or trop fish for tropical fish. And within the traces system, they may only list the first species in a shipment and attribute the entire number to that one species. And so our actual quality of this data is very, very variable. And we clearly need better and more standardized guidelines to understand what species are in trade. It's also important to highlight that this is not a niche interest. It was estimated that actually there are more pet reptiles than pet dogs in the UK, mainly because many people who have reptiles will have many of them. And the fact that today's young people may not be able to afford a house or have space for a dog, plus they have a full-time job. But having pets like reptiles or an aquaria is low maintenance and takes up less space, meaning that these species are becoming increasingly attractive. And being that shops have no need to declare the origins of their animals, if you go and buy a chameleon because it's cool, you probably aren't aware that that chameleon almost certainly came from the wild because most chameleons in trade do come from the wild, and that it will probably be dead in a year because the mortality rates are very, very high. This highlights the fact that we need to educate the public because otherwise they will continue to buy cool animals, not realizing that it is harming native populations, and survival rate remains low. So let's take a little bit of a deep dive into the reptiles because we did some analysis on them a couple of years ago. So we found out in our initial paper that just under 4,000 species were in trade. This number has since increased with our most recent assessment. So there's around 4,000 species of reptiles in trade. This makes up a little under 50% of all reptile species. To put that in perspective, it's over 50% of all species in pretty much any given area of the planet. And it includes critically endangered and data deficient species. Now, for the 116 data deficient species, these are species for which there is so little data, we cannot assess their rarity. And yet they are in trade, legally, in most instances. What we also found that given that any kind of regulation is reactive rather than proactive, it means if I go out and describe a species, you can go there and collect it and export it legally. And in fact, there is a joke that every time a new cave gecko species is described in Myanmar, 2 Germans get on a plane with empty suitcases. Now, the reason that that joke is about the Germans is because some of the major trade is from the big reptile fair Touristica in Ham. And this is a global hub for wildlife trade, particularly of exotic animals. And so we found that within basically 20 years of description, that 133 new species were in trade, and that included multiple species that were in trade the year they were described. And this is just for reptiles. So 9 species appear in trade the same year that they were scientifically described, and around 21 species are thought to have had their entire wild population collected out, and so they've been totally extirpated, largely for the pet trade and probably based on the species description. If we look at any country, so here blue is the species that are not in trade, red is the species that are in trade. But if we look for the animals that are in trade, at what proportion actually have CITES regulations, for the reptiles, only New Zealand and Madagascar have the majority of their traded reptile species actually covered by CITES. And that means for literally every other country, most reptile species that could be threatened by trade are not regulated by CITES, and so we have basically no data on what is in trade. If we look at it in terms of the status, that includes multiple data deficient and endangered species. So across the African continent, most species in trade, we don't have enough data to even make an assessment of their vulnerability to extinction. Whereas in Southeast Asia, they're either critically endangered or they have too little data to assess. The fact that we have this number of species in trade for which we can't even assess their vulnerability highlights the need for urgent action to better collate data on what is in trade, where it is coming from, and what impact it might be having on source populations. And so what we can also see is, unfortunately, CITES is not delivering. It doesn't provide the granularity of data to understand what is in trade and where it's coming from. If we look at LEMIS, the LEMIS data highlights just how big the problem is, as does the online trade. But the problem with online trade is we have no idea where those animals came from. They might have been bred in the seller's back room or behind the seller as he uploads the listing onto Touristica or whatever website he's using. They may have been imported from Kenya, Tanzania, or Madagascar. And there is no means to get that data at present. What is also alarming is if we look at the number of species of reptile described each year, which is high, versus the range, we see that more and more species are described every year, but their ranges are progressively smaller. Now, given that there is a huge attraction for newly described species, and many species are appearing in trade within just years of description, these species have only been described now because they probably have very small ranges. And that means just a few harvesters going to collect them could completely extirpate the species and threaten it with extinction. If we split it down, and again, this is just for the reptiles, we'll see that for the majority of species, with the exception of the crocodiles, huge numbers of individuals are coming from the wild. So around 70 or so % of lizard species are coming from the wild still. We can also map out what this looks like in terms of the species that are being impacted. Now, important to note here, if anyone says, oh, but CITES monitors what's in trade, if we map out what is in trade in CITES, you can't even get basic patterns. If we map it out using other data sources like online trade and LEMIS, we can see that unsurprisingly, most trade is coming from species that are tropical. And if we compare this to the amphibians, we get very similar patterns. So the Amazon is unsurprisingly being very hard hit. It's also important to note that we know that in many of these regions, like South America, there will be regional hubs where some countries are exporting many species that are not native. So clearly they get trafficked over a border and then they get exported under the guise of legality because it is very easy to track things over these these borders without it being detected. And we know that this is happening multiple times, meaning much of what is purportedly legal trade will not have been sourced legally. We can also, of course, look at where threatened species are coming from. So once again, the majority of amphibians in trade, a huge percentage are coming from the wild. And theoretically, only 0.01% is illegal. But this is only based on what is seized. We know that the source of many of these will not have been legal. But again, it's this gray area because things that get trafficked over borders, there is no data on that. And if we look at small range species or threatened species, the majority of them are coming from either Asia or from South America. We can also map out what the drivers of trade are for these various groups. And so we can see quite similar patterns, but there are some differences here. So for meat trade, Asia is becoming a little bit more dominant. And then for medicine trade, huge numbers of species are being exported from Asia for medicinal trade for various reasons. And once again, we can see that large numbers of animals are appearing in trade with just within years of description. And if you have a species that has just been described appearing in trade, it is probably already very rare. That is why it only just got described. And so we clearly need measures that are proactive to ensure that newly described species don't instantly appear in trade. So around half individuals in both the reptiles and amphibians are coming from the wild. Large numbers of species are appearing in trade within just years of their description. The global biodiversity hotspots are also the hotspots of trade, and very few regions have the majority of species that are in trade actually under international regulations like CITES. And the majority of this is legal. Now, of course, this isn't just, as I've said earlier, a pattern of threat that only impacts on vertebrates. We often forget about groups like the arachnids, which also show massive patterns of threat. Now, this is really important because trying to analyze what these patterns look like for invertebrates is really challenging. For the majority of species, we do not have good data on even a clear taxonomic backbone. And yet, when we analyzed this, we found about 1,300 species of arachnids that were in trade, and this isn't even including the other group of arachnids, the amblypygids, because their taxonomy is just too fluid. Furthermore, we found potentially 100 undescribed species of arachnid in trade, where sellers were consistently using a locality or a color pattern to note it as being unique. It's assumed that invertebrates breed fast and they have wide distributions. But about 75% of these species occur in one country or less, and over 90% occur in less than five countries. And so actually many of these species are range limited. And particularly when it comes to groups like the tarantulas, many of them are also slow reproducers and easy to damage during transport. And unsurprisingly, despite the fact only a majority of species have been assessed by the IUCN, this already includes threatened, endangered, and critically endangered groups. So when we look at this, unsurprisingly, the most threatened groups by trade are things like the tarantulas, also the jumping spiders, because they're cool and colorful and super short-lived, as well as the boothid scorpions. But here, and I mentioned this earlier, when we look at what is in Lemis, it is a tiny proportion compared to the online trade. And so clearly animals are being traded online for which we have absolutely no data of what those trade routes look like. Furthermore, once again, we know that there are regional hub countries that animals are being tracked into for neighboring countries because they are being exported from the wild from countries to which they are not native. And we can map all of this out so we can try to understand the hotspots of trade. And again, we see hundreds of species that appear in trade within just a few years of their description. So almost 200 species in trade. That included 24% of the tarantula species described since 2000. Now, it's important to note that the tarantulas are listed by CITES, but no one really cares, and so they still get traded. And so because people see invertebrates as a trivial issue, they're still not doing any due diligence in terms of understanding the impact of this trade on native species. And once again, the global tropics are a major source. And we also see very large numbers for most groups coming from the wild. So the wild here is shown in red, For the biggest numbers, the only group for which most animals are coming from captivity is Mesobuthus. Mesobuthus is the most common scorpion used in Chinese medicine and also snacks. And so they are being bred in captivity because you need large numbers. But for all other groups, if you see a spider in trade, there is a very high chance that it came from the wild. But this trade is really hard to monitor. For example, even in the online trade, you can order a mystery box, and then to your home will be delivered a box full of mysterious spiders, and you don't know what's there. Now, okay, just like Pokemon, people might like the surprise, but it means we have no idea of what's in trade, let alone the impacts on these species. So when there has been any form of regulation, the predominant reason has been to control disease, because trading animals has a high risk of spreading diseases and pathogens. We clearly need to modernize our understanding of trade. This means, as a basic thing, inventorying what species are being imported and exported, in what quantities and from where, as well as if they're coming from the wild. Because it is insane that in 2025, we still do not know how many species are in trade. And most countries do not realize just how many species are being traded. Literally up to around 60 or 70,000 species is a conservative estimate. And most of these populations are not being monitored. And so when people talk about sustainable use, sustainability means you need to know the impact on the wild population. Yet we don't know what's in trade, where it's coming from, and that population that it's being exported from. We also know that if we allow species to be traded until they're on the brink of extinction, then we will already have lost considerable genetic diversity, and the species is at risk of going extinct. Now, I'm very briefly going to talk about a number of other major forms of trade because I wouldn't be doing justice to these groups if I didn't. The global fish trade and the aquaria trade is one of the fastest growing forms of trade. Now, thankfully, around 90% of ornamental freshwater fish are coming from captivity now. However, up to 95% of marine fish, as I've mentioned earlier, are coming from the wild. Many of them are also under threat from other sources like crown of thorns starfish or scorpionfish, which are threatening reef systems. And so these are species that are being threatened by trade, by a loss of habitat, by invasive species, and by climate change. We are going the right way towards driving these species extinct. And yet, for most of them, we don't even record accurately what is in trade. And often when they are imported, regions just see it as a trivial issue, and they do not inventory what is being collected. As I mentioned earlier, we also know that injurious species are continuing to be traded, as are multiple species that are known as good invasive species. Some of the most invasive species in the world are still being legally traded. And when we know such huge issues are associated with the trade of these species, we really have to ask ourselves why we continue to trade them in huge volumes when we know the negative impacts on native ecosystems. So in summary, most of this trade is thought to be legal. Now, I've already mentioned that this is a much bigger gray area because most of it is basically put into a gray zone where it will be traded into an intermediate country, often illegally and undetected over borders, and then traded under the guise of legality. But because everyone takes this as a trivial issue, in many instances, this is not well recorded. Focusing only on known illegal trade ignores the majority of species in trade. We also know that high numbers of species continue to come from the wild. And for many groups, well, over 90% of species, at least some individuals are coming from the wild. For many species, particularly invertebrates, the majority of individuals may be coming from the wild. For most species, we don't have population data. And so we have no idea of what impact this is having on wild populations. New species are in trade, sometimes within just months of their description, despite the fact that they have all of the traits associated with vulnerability. And no data for most species is available outside the US. So regions like Europe in particular urgently need to update the standards of databases like traces and start making them available at least to researchers to help understand the dimensions of trade. This is also critical for CITES to do its job, because at the moment, when you try to list a species onto CITES, you have a burden of proof to show that trade might be a risk. And yet, when no data is collected, you can't prove that trade is a risk because there is no data. And so you have a chicken and egg situation where you have no means of proving threat, because until threat is proven, you can't collect the data you need to prove threat. As I said earlier, IPBES estimates around 50,000 species are in trade, but we know this is an underestimate. And so until countries start better databasing what's in trade and making that data available, it's going to be a guessing game where much unsustainable trade continues to be undetected. And so we clearly need better data. So we clearly need a better approach. The current approach is driving species towards extinction. Basic data on what is in trade is essential. And at the moment, even the indicators we are using does not do justice to the vast volumes of trade in groups that we continue to ignore and forget. Furthermore, every other element of commercial trade is now well monitored internationally. And yet we still see wildlife trade as just a fringe issue when it clearly isn't. Always treating biodiversity as this optional extra will inevitably drive species extinct, invisibly, and without the data to actually understand as we move there. So we need better non-detriment findings. We need better understandings of the risks posed. We need to stop conflating legal trade with sustainable trade, and also realize that much trade that is thought of as sustainable may not actually be because we don't have good enough data. And without proactive measures, we need to assume that much of this trade is unsustainable. So given that this is based, the e-cost is based in the EU is a major market. The data is not openly available. And whilst LEMIS is far from perfect, if the traces data better aligned with it, and we saw the improvements that we previously outlined, we could have a much more robust global system of collating international trade data. I'm not going to go onto this much because this is from where I sit now, but I want to remind everyone on this call that CITES has been going for 50 years. We need to make sure it protects and monitors all wildlife. And whereas we often focus on a subset of species, it's time that we better collect data so that we can assess the risk to all species and ensure it's adequately conserved. So for those interested, we also had a special issue out last year, which I encourage you to look at. And for now, I'm happy to take any questions you might have, and anyone is also welcome to contact me later. My email address is very easy to find, so please get in touch if anything I've raised today is interesting or important, or you want to have a further discussion. Thank you all.
Wow, thanks so much, Alice. That was really great. I just wanted to check with you briefly before we move on to questions, if you do have time for questions. If not, we can.
I have brief time for some short questions.
Okay. Then I'll open the floor if anybody wants to raise their hand, or you can just unmute.
Pedro! Hello.
Hello, Alice. How are you? I have to ask something. This will be a very general question, not really directly related with this, but when you talk with the spider, the people that bring traffic the spiders into Europe and then breed them, they
Yep.
always have this excuse that, okay, people are just destroying the habitat of these species in Brazil or Indonesia or wherever, and we are saving the species. So in fact, they always have this excuse, they are the saviors. Do you know any instance where this was the case, that a breeder, even if illegal, at some point contributed to the protection of a species?
I mean, there's always this argument, and there's now more captive tigers than there is wild tigers, but they never get reintroduced again. And so I think it's an easy excuse. There are some instances where there is a good justification for having captive populations, like there have been many examples with frogs, because populations were basically transported because of the risk of chytrid, bred in zoos, and then re-released. But that was a very targeted, programmatic example when the risk wasn't just habitat loss, it was a disease. And it's like, okay, let's stabilize and have reservoir populations whilst we deal with this. There are no equivalent examples for arachnids. And in most species threatened by pet trade, there are also no examples. When they go into collections, they don't come out. You couldn't release them if you wanted to, and you might introduce more pathogens into wild populations. Releasing animals is something that is controlled and managed because of the biosecurity risks. And so it's a nice line, but there's no evidence to prove it. The best place for most wildlife is in the wild. And unless we are going to wipe out the entire wild population because we know that particular habitat is at risk or there is a disease that is coming through, then no, it's not going to be a reservoir, especially when it then never gets out of someone's tank or aquaria.
Okay, thank you. I'll have another question if possible. Okay, so if you could just have 2 or 3 really short advice for LAMIs in case we import the model to the European Union, what could improve in LAMIs that quite quickly that will be really useful to have in the EU?
Okay, one thing, making sure that you have an accurate declaration if it's wild or captive. I've been told by some people, sometimes they will put wild as a default. Clearly knowing if it's wild or not, we need to know that information. All the information should be as verifiable as possible. There should also be the automated flagging and detection of suspicious records. So when you have the units wrong, something might be meant to be a number and it's been reported in grams, you can get something that appears to be thousands or even millions of individuals, but it's because it's in the wrong units. If you have quick ways of flagging clearly erroneous entries, then you can correct them at the point of entry rather than someone later trying to correct it and having issues with it. We also would want to move towards something where there is more automation, where we synthesize it with things like photographs so that we can get better recognition of species to try to reduce laundering. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it would be great if we could pair it with something like barcodes, which would totally eliminate the need to have any form of relying on someone to be truthful. Because if you're trying to import something which is illegal, it's very easy to just say it's something else. And unless you have a well-trained customs guard, how are they meant to pick that up? If we start using things like barcoding with the MinION, it has never been faster, easier, and cheaper, then we can start to build better data and actually increase the accuracy of data. So those are 3 examples that I think would dramatically improve the accuracy. And we need better data because if we don't have better data, we can't manage and protect species efficiently.
Okay, thank you.
Most welcome.
Very quickly, Alice, where can people find your contact information? How can people get in contact with you so that they can follow up with any questions?
I can put my email in the chat. And then people are welcome to contact me there.
Great. We will
and you can always Google me.
Great. We'll be posting this YouTube video up in the next few days as well. So if anybody has any further questions on YouTube, feel free to put them in the chat. Alice, do you have time for one more question from Richard?
A very quick one. I let them know I'll join them soon, so go for it.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your very interactive lecture. I really liked it. My question is very simple. Of course, I'm a law student, so I'm looking at this issue primarily through like a legal perspective. There has been a lot of debate. Also, currently, Council of Europe adopted like a new convention on the protection of environment through criminal law. And there has been a lot of debate whether the current legal framework that we have in place, also CITES, for example, whether it can truly accurately protect animals or wildlife generally. Because also on the European Union level, we have several instruments, but are they really effective to an extent?
So CITES is reasonably effective at regulating CITES listed species. The issue is that most species aren't in CITES, and it's progressively hard to list species in CITES because you get interested groups that push back against it, and because there is no systematic collation of data, proving harm from trade is often very difficult because until it is listed in CITES, you're not collecting the data. So CITES is a start. I would advocate for a fundamental shift in how I would advocate for what's called reverse listing. So you would have to prove it was sustainable before you can list it. This has been a discussion that has been ongoing since 1985. So sadly, we might not win it anytime soon. but we certainly need a better databasing of what is in trade, because if we don't know what's in trade, there is no way we can assess how sustainable it is. And even it inhibits CITES function, not just because you can't list things effectively, but because you can launder things through by pretending it's something else. There are, as you said, numerous different legal frameworks. There is also the CBD. The CBD has various other regulations, but I think wildlife trade is sadly continuing to fall through the cracks of much of this. And because unlike the US, Europe doesn't have the equivalent of the Lacey Act. And so there is some countries will have an NDF. So I know, for example, the Netherlands does have a system where you're meant to prove it was legal. Other countries, it's a lot grayer. And that means that you probably get a lot of undetected illegal trade where they didn't have source permits, but it wasn't noticed. And so things just come in. And then you only have to satisfy quarantine laws or any phytosanitary regulations, which is not about endangerment.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
All right, we're going to close it off here. I know, Alice, you have to head out. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and special thanks to Alice for a great webinar. And we'll see you all on YouTube in the next few days.
Most welcome. Good talking to you all. Bye for now.